Welcome to the Voice of Islam. The Voice of Islam is a weekly radio program organized by the Islamic Council of Jamaica, the umbrella organization for the Muslim community in Jamaica, to propagate the message of Islam, dispel the common misconceptions about Islam, and facilitate a medium to provide Islamic perspective on topical issues and alternative solutions. You may contact the Islamic Council of Jamaica at 648-9545. That's 648-9545. You are listening to the Voice of Islam. Before we begin, let's take a few minutes to listen to the recitation of verses selected from the final revelation to mankind, Al-Quran.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم يا أيها الذين آمنوا قوا أنفسكم وأهليكم نارا وقودها الناس والحجارة عليها ملائكة غلاظ شداد لا يعصون الله ما أمرهم ويفعلون ما يؤمرون. I seek refuge in Allah from the shaitan, the outcast. In the name of Allah, the most gracious, the most merciful. O you who believe, save yourselves and your families from a fire whose fuel is men and stones, over which angels are appointed, who are stern and severe, who flinch not from executing the commands they receive from Allah, but do precisely what they are commanded.
You are listening to the Voice of Islam.
In continuation of the last episode with regards to exaggeration, about 7 years ago, I met a student from the Bargash family, and I started asking him about his travels in terms of his family lineage and his tribe between the Eastern Africa and the Arabian Peninsula. And what the honest historians have come to realize is that there was no distinction whatsoever between what we now see as the African continent and the Arabian Peninsula. There was no Africa-Asia thing. What we should know is that in November of 1884, a very low-life, evil person by the name of Otto von Bismarck chairmaned a conference known as the Berlin Conference, which ended in February of 1885. And it was in that period, between November of 1884 to February of 1885, known as the Scramble of Africa Conference, where there was a greater division, it was already divided, of what was called Africa, and of course rule and conquering domination over Asia. Okay? But continentally, the peninsula was connected to Africa, which makes it naturally Northeast Africa. So in speaking to this young man, he had family members that had gone to Zanzibar. And it should be noted that when Tanganyika and Zanzibar had it split, officially, because Zanzibar still does exist, the name Tanzania evolved. And the president in 1964, a decent man by the name of Julius K. Nyerere, a very, very good friend of Prime Minister number 4 or 5, I think it's 4, Michael Norman Manley. And Zanzibar is a place where the Omanis did have slaves. And the head of that was Tib in the 1800s. When? In the 1800s. Oman is on the far reaches of the Arabian Peninsula, but they did have some trading going on in the place called Zanzibar. When the Omanis first came to Zanzibar, they helped to resist, because they themselves are Muslims. Muslims don't enslave, but because Islam says is against it. But some Muslims may have been involved, and not may have been involved, in this case, were involved on the east coast of Africa, not on the west coast. Okay? So they resisted the Portuguese. But when they took over later, they themselves became slave traders and pirates themselves. Okay? And unfortunately, they were involved. But the exaggeration now is that when Dr. Sharif, a writer on the island of Zanzibar, he had a tour, he's connected with the tour guides there. And there was this Catholic church built on the slave market during the 17 and 1800s, built by the British. And Sultan Bargash, I've met one of his descendants who said that, the family had been there, who was ruling at the time in the 90s. He was ruling in the 90s. There was a professor called Professor Hamid who was in charge of the archives. And basically, the slave chambers that people spoke about in books, this is the deception, was basically a place where the British stored medicine because there was a great cholera outbreak, and that there was a low volume of trading going on by the Omanis. So some scholars have discovered that many people who write these books and they have reached into the halls of academia, their aim is to present Islam in a way so that it will turn off people who are Afro-Brazilians, Afro-Caribbean people, and African Americans. That's the aim. That's disgusting. That is not true to scholarship, and it is patently false. Also, something has come to the fore. We may anglicize the word al-murabitun as al-muravid. Conrad and Fisher, with extensive finances and extensive research, have gone in and looked at the writings of al-Bakri and the historians such as Ibn Battuta, who lived in the 1300s, who wrote a famous rihla, his traveling logs, in 1352. And what they found out was that the Al-Murabitun, strict, fervent Muslims in North and Northwest Africa, they assisted the king of Ghana in the 1000s. They assisted the king. So they wrote a book called The Conquest That Never Was. It was never conquered. There was no war whatsoever. That's not an exaggeration. That's just a plain piece of falsehood that I've made it into books. This is why we have to look at things empirically and from the original sources. We must do so, or we will end up spreading only lies. In terms of authenticity, there's no one that can deny that Sheikh Anta Diop, who died in 1986, was a man who knew what he was talking about concerning African history when it comes to Islam. And he wrote in his book on page 163 that the primary reason for the success of Islam, which we can safely determine is the history or the heritage of people who are in Jamaica. Why? We are primarily from West Africa. And the majority there, and many West African tribes were Muslim. And no Christians, with all due respects, came on the boat or any of the boats at any time. But in all honesty, not everyone was Muslim. Not everyone was Muslim. There were two types, Muslims and animists. Any person who expressed, we believe in the one God, we believe in the one God, during that period, safely was from an Islamic tradition. Those who had other traditions from West or West Central Africa, but there were no Christians because the missionaries didn't get there until the 1800s, 1820s, 1880s. So our traditions are either African tribal beliefs, which vary, and Islam only. That is the heritage. Sheikh Anta Diop, who died in 1986, he knew about 7 languages. He is renowned amongst the scholars of repute in terms of anthropology, social anthropology, and history, and linguistics. He said the primary reason for the success of Islam in Black Africa, with one exception, consequently stems from the fact that it was propagated peacefully at first by solitary Arabic-speaking Berbers from North Africa, travelers to certain black kings and notables, who then spread it about them to those under their jurisdiction. What is to be emphasized here is the peaceful nature of this conversion, regardless of the legend surrounding it. Where can this be found? In his book, Pre-Colonial Black Africa, page 163. He also said on page 102 of the same book that the Arab conquests, because when someone says Arab conquest, they're thinking of Islam. And this is where the deception comes in. But Sheikh Anta Diop, who no one can deny his genius, says that the Arab conquests, dear to the sociologists of today, are necessary to their theories, but did not exist in reality. It did not exist in reality. To this day, no reliable historical documents substantiate such theories. So all the efforts to try to divert Afro-Jamaicans, Afro-Caribbean people, Afro-Brazilian people, African Americans from Islam, it won't work if you go back to the sources. He says on page 167 that Islam was and remains in large part a living religion in Black Africa. Remember now, the Arabian Peninsula that you want to separate and that we sometimes would like to separate and try to evince that the people are looking different was not on the continental divide until the Berlin Conference of 1884. Okay, so Sheikh Anta Diop on page 167 is saying that that Islam remains in large part a living religion in Black Africa, in contrast to the Christianity of the West, which tends to become among Europeans a mere religious custom. As in the Western Middle Ages, teaching was in the hands of the clergy, which in the case of West Africa, the word here is used Mohammedan, which is what you'd call an Oriental term in the 1500s to describe Muslims. Documents now at our disposal permit us to describe, let's go by documents and be intelligent about it, permit us to describe in detail the intellectual life of the university, particularly that of the University of Sankore in Timbuktu, current-day Mali. The schedule of courses lasted all day, interrupted only at the times of prayer. In Africa, the language of higher education was Arabic. It's true. It really is true, audience. And when you think of Swahili or Hausa, 60 or 70% of Swahili is Arabic, because Arabic is it's a universal, it's universal in its nature. Just go to Arabic classes for a month or two and you'll believe. Okay? Arabic is not necessarily in its design, when you look at it, for the Arabian Peninsula only. It has a type of elasticity to it that encompasses other language groups. So the word Swahili comes from the word Sahel, which means coasts. So the coastal languages, or the coastal expressions, east and west, you have now Swahili. Okay? So the language of higher education was Arabic. The Quran was the principal text to be studied, the one which all others derived. It contained the sum of all that existed, past, present, future, the whole universe. Also, Sheikh Anta Diop made a refutation to the falsehood presented in Chancellor Williams's book, The Destruction of a Black Civilization, and Joseph Ben Jochannan, who those men, they do not use primary source to teach. Slave mongering and invading. And this is not a defense now of any Arabs who are involved. We're just saying Islam as a way of life has nothing to do with slave trading and slave mongering. On page 101, Sheikh Anta Diop, who died in 1986, said this: much has been made of Arab invasions of Africa. They occurred in the north, but in black Africa, they are figments of the imagination. And in the north, when that began around December of 639, it was when Abdullah ibn Amr, one of the companions of the Prophet, peace be upon him, he was the Emir of Egypt during the rulership, or the Khilafah, the Caliphate of Umar ibn al-Khattab. And the Persians and the Romans attacked the Muslims. He sent a letter to Umar, and Umar responded and said, you have to defend. So of course there was a skirmish, of course there was a war, but not for people to convert. No way. Because the Quran says in chapter 2 verse 256, La ikraha fi din, qad tabayyana rushdi min al-ghayy. Let there be no compulsion. That means no compulsion in someone accepting the religion, to practice the religion, because the truth is made clearly from error. It's a choice. It's a clear choice. And when you look at it very carefully, if someone holds a gun to my head or holds a knife to my throat and say, repeat after me, Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah wa ashhadu anna Muhammadan Rasulullah, which can be translated, I testify that there is nothing that has the right to be worshipped except Allah, and I testify that the Prophet Muhammad is the last messenger of Allah. Did I really become a Muslim then? By force? It can't work, because I have to know how to fast. I have to know what time I should do the morning prayer known as Fajr. I should know what time to do the afternoon prayer, the late afternoon prayer, the sunset prayer. Okay? I should know the details of the rites of pilgrimage, Umrah or Hajj in Mecca. I have to know how to fast during the Ramadan, during the month of Ramadan. That takes details. How am I going to know it's 2.5% of my savings after my expenses that I should give to the poor and the needy for the wealth redistribution system? How am I going to know, and how am I going to calculate it? Especially with my family members. How will I know how to give zakat al-fitr at the end of Ramadan to purify my fast? So no one can be a Muslim by force. It takes details, because to be a Muslim, it means you're practicing. You can call yourself Muslim, but doesn't mean you are Muslim. And it doesn't mean that a person who is a weak practitioner is not a Muslim. Doesn't mean that. It means that you cannot be forced to become a Muslim. So in further quotation of Sheikh Anta Diop, during the period of our study from the 3rd to the 17th centuries, not one conquest was ever launched by way of the Nile River. So where are these stories coming from about invasions in Egypt? Nor was there ever any conquest by the Muslims or the Arabs of Mozambique or any other East African territory. None whatsoever. Even the conservative Dr. W.E.B. Du Bois, who is buried in Ghana, I think he died in 1963 and he's buried in Ghana. He said, in this whole story of the so-called Arab slave trade, the truth has been strangely twisted. He also said a secondary result of the British and American slavery and slave trade, and specifically was based on American demand for ivory. Because history informs us that the only real role that a few of the Arabs played in our enslavement came a long time after the Spanish. Of course, the Portuguese were before the Spanish, then the Dutch and the French and the British, and then of course the Americans, who encompass all those nationalities and ethnic groups, had massively dominated Africa for several centuries. This involvement by only a small clique of Arabs had its true beginning and ending in the 19th century, and even then it was but a secondary result of the British and American slavery and slave trade, and specifically was based on American demand for ivory. Where can you find this? The World in Africa, page 68, by Dr. W.E.B. Du Bois. He even said about the Muslim African that Gao, Timbuktu, and Djenné were intellectual centers, and at the University of Sankore gathered thousands of students of law, literature, grammar, geography, and surgery. A literature began to develop in the 16th and 17th century. The university was in correspondence with the best institutions on the Mediterranean coast. Black universities sent black scholars to learn and lecture to the Mediterranean world. Black historians like Abdurrahman as-Sa'di wrote the Bible of the Sudan, or Tariq al-Sudan, and Tariq al-Fatah. From this Africa, a new cultural impulse entered Europe, because Europe didn't really have any thriving universities of such at that time, and became the Renaissance. Where is this? Page 211 and page 223 of W.E.B. Du Bois' book. He's not a Muslim, and he wrote this because he went to the sources. He went to the sources. So did Basil Davidson, a non-Muslim. So did many other scholars of repute. Go to the sources, and the truth will, as we say from time to time, set us free. Assalamu alaikum.
You are listening to the Voice of Islam. Thank you all for listening to the Voice of Islam, a weekly radio program organized by the Islamic Council of Jamaica to propagate the message of Islam, dispel the common misconceptions about Islam, and facilitate a medium to provide Islamic perspective on topical issues and alternative solutions. Remember, you may collect a free Quran, yes, a free Quran, by emailing us, sending a text message, or visiting any of our locations. Please send in your questions and comments to islamradiojm@gmail.com. That's islamradiojm@gmail.com, or by text message to 892-1350. That's 892-1350. You may also visit our Facebook page, facebook.com/Islamic Council of Jamaica, or find us on Instagram at ICOJ_official, or you may listen to a past episode on our YouTube channel, Islamic Council of Jamaica. You may also visit any of the following locations: Islamic Council of Jamaica, 24 Camp Road, Kingston 4. Masjidul Aziz, Portmore Central Plaza, West Tradeway, Portmore. Masjidul Rahman, Windsor Road, Spanish Town. Islamic Dawah Center, 1 Makati Street, Montego Bay. Masjidul Hakim, 138 Main Street, Ocho Rios. Masjid As-Sabr, Albany, St. Mary. Masjid Hussein, 3 Miles River, Westmoreland. Masjidul Haq, New Green Road, Mandeville. Masjid An-Nur, Port Maria, St. Mary. Masjidul Ihsan, West End Road, Negril. Masjid Al-Taqwa, Newell, St. Elizabeth. Masjid Ibrahim, Riversdale, St. Catherine. Masjid As-Sakina, 26 Miriam Way, Montego Bay. Peace be upon you all. Assalamu alaikum.
Allah